At last, a voice for people who pay big government's bills, not those who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000 member National Taxpayers Union. I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to this week's broadcast. We have a lot going on thanks to Tax Filing Day 2009, headlined by, of course, a whole lot of tea parties going around the country, and we're seeing hundreds of them very well attended by people who are fed up with high taxes, bailouts, debts being passed along to future generations. But one component that's often overlooked about the public outrage over the federal government's financial policies is the complexity of the tax system itself. And that's something that National Taxpayers Union has followed for a number of years, thanks to its ongoing project called A Taxing Trend, the rise in complexity, forms, and paperwork burdens of the tax system. Is that not correct, Natasha?
Yes, it is, Pete. This year, any taxpayers using any of the 1040 tax form series spent an average of 26.4 hours, that's more than a day, and $209 completing their returns for this most current tax year. That's up from 25.4 hours and $185 just 4 years ago.
Now, this is a very, very wide average for 1040 income tax filers. Your actual experience may be much, much worse. In fact, when you add up all of the paperwork burdens caused by the individual and corporate income tax systems alone, this has been done through the information collection budget of the United States. I pity the poor folks who have to go through that number crunching. But if you look in there and you add it all up, you'll find that the Treasury Department's paperwork burden imposed on the United States is 7.75 billion with a B hours. 7 of those 7.75 billion hours, 7 billion, comprises the federal income tax system alone, corporate and personal. 3.8 billion of the 7 billion hours fall on the shoulders of individual income tax filers, 3.2 billion hours on the shoulders of corporate income tax filers, which means anyway that those burdens get passed along to each and every American in the form of higher costs for goods and services, or passed along to workers with these firms who either don't get the compensation increases they're hoping for, or don't get hired in the first place. The other class that bears these kinds of burdens are shareholders who get disappointed with smaller returns because these businesses have to keep such a huge overhead for filling out these tax returns. What's the total cost? Well, we tried to add that up. We took a look at the average wages for accountants, as well as the average private sector wage for individual professionals. We added that up, plus the billions of out-of-pocket costs that individual taxpayers shell out for things like software. The total price tag, $299 billion with a B dollars. That's how much in lost time, in out-of-pocket expenses, in supplies, in software that our individual and business income tax system costs America. The costs go on and on after that in terms of lost economic opportunities. There's a lot of theory out there about how much that could amount to, but at the very least, we're talking about a near $300 billion burden on taxpayers just for complying with the paperwork of income taxes. There are those who say, hey, our tax system is very efficient in terms of how much the IRS is funded and how much it spends versus how much in income tax revenue it brings in. Well, if you count only the IRS's budget versus what gets collected, sure, that's very efficient. But the problem is the IRS exports the burden of collecting taxes onto us. That's the problem. We are the ones who end up spending the money, who end up wasting the time, who end up going through a lot of frustration.
So once again, that's American individuals and corporations are spending almost $300 billion on tax compliance. That's more than $100 billion higher than the IRS National Taxpayer Advocate Office estimated.
Yes, and when you take a look at those 7 billion hours spent in complying with the business and personal income tax systems, let's try and break that down a little more, Natasha. Doesn't that equal a whole lot of employees at private firms in the United States if we were to do the math that way?
It is. 7.75 billion hours is the equivalent of about 3.7 million employees working 40-hour weeks year-round without any vacation. That's more workers than are employed at the 5 biggest employers among Fortune 500 companies combined. That would be Walmart, United Parcel Service, McDonald's, International Business Machines, and Citigroup.
Incredible. And when you think also in terms of the automation of our financial lives, the fact that the information age has made so many things so much easier for us to do. You can trade online at the speed of light. You can bank online. You can keep financial records of your mutual funds, your retirement investments. All of this via computer. It's much faster. It's much more practical. It helps to avoid a lot of errors in math and bookkeeping that you might otherwise make. Yet, despite all this, taxes remain more and more a problem for individuals, even despite all the automation. The complexity of this system is so bad, and the predilection of politicians to keep rewarding friends and punishing foes through all of these complex credits and deductions and loopholes and special rates, that has overwhelmed the technology of the information age. And so people now spend more time than ever trying to comply with the system, even if they're trying to use computer software to keep up with it all. It's a frightful situation when 535 members of Congress can thwart even the brilliance of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and all the folks at Intuit and other places who have invented these computers as well as the tax preparation software to go with them.
Technology aside, let's get into the nitty-gritty of tax forms and instructions that don't involve billions and millions and those kinds of figures. The number of lines on the 1040 form went down by 1 line from 77 to 76 lines for the first time in 12 years. This is due to the residential energy credit coming off the form. But even though the return is 1 line shorter, the 1040 instruction booklet grew yet again by another 6 pages to 161 pages. That's over quadruple the number of instruction pages in the instructions from 1975 and more than triple the number from 1985, the year before taxes were, quote, simplified.
Yeah, remember that, Gimme Radio listeners, the famous Tax Reform Act of 1986. Not a bad effort on the part of Congress. They streamlined the number of brackets down to just 2, 15, and 28%. They flattened out a lot of the loopholes in the tax code so that even though you were subject to income taxes on more of the money you earned, the rates you were paying were lower, and most individuals made out better under the system. It was easier to comprehend, and it was more economically neutral. Unfortunately, it remained that way for, well, less than about 3 years, because by 1990, the U.S. Congress and the president began talking, and they were saying, well, we need to try and raise more revenue to get out of the deficit spending they were facing. And George H.W. Bush, the former president's, just outgoing president's father, broke his famous read my lips, no new taxes pledge and agreed to install a 3rd tax bracket. That, folks, was the beginning of the end for the 1986 tax reform. It went all downhill from there because once the Republicans got in league with liberal Democrats and said, okay, we'll just undo this simplified system a little bit and we'll promise never to tinker with it again. Didn't happen that way. Once Bill Clinton came into office, we got 2 more brackets added on to the third that George H.W. Bush imposed. We got a whole slew of additional credits. We had more takebacks of deductions, phase-outs of tax breaks. And so, once again, we could not resist the urge to add complexity to the code, and boy, have taxpayers been paying through the nose for that ever since.
Today's short form is 48 lines long, and that's about double the number of lines on the 1945 version of the standard 1040 tax return. The short form's instructions are 84 pages, which is as long as the long form instruction booklet from 1995.
So in other words, even if you want to try and use the more simple forms that the IRS claims will allow you to file your taxes quickly and without a lot of pain, it's becoming almost impossible to do that. If you were itemizing your deductions, say 15 years ago, okay, you faced an instruction booklet of, maybe 70, 80 pages. Nowadays, of course, it's twice that. If you were using the short form back then, 15 years ago or so, the so-called 1040A, your instruction booklet seemed relatively modest. But as Natasha just said, even the short form instructions have grown to nearly 100 bloody pages. We can't keep doing this, folks, because what's going to happen is the United States may soon find itself in the position of a country like Italy, where the tax code becomes so punitive, so complex, so impenetrable, people really either don't know how to comply with the law, or they're so fed up with it all that they just walk away from the system. That's why I think tax reform is an almost inevitable thing for the United States, not because our politicians are altruistic and they want to spare us all of this frustration, but rather, sooner or later, we are going to get in a position where the system's going to collapse under the weight of its own complexity. When that happens, the revenues will stop flowing to Washington the way politicians want them, and they will be forced to confront tax simplification. This study shows that the day of reckoning is coming a lot sooner than many people think.
Even if taxpayers don't want to wade through hundreds of pages of instructions, the cost to have your taxes prepared by a professional such as H&R Block or another company have been rising year after year as well. This year, the average fee charged by H&R Block, which prepares 1 in 7 tax returns filed by all Americans, rose about 8%, costs about an average of $183.79 to have your taxes prepared by H&R Block.
And once again, Gimme Radio listeners, these are averages. Your actual experience could be a whole lot worse. Take, for example, a small business owner. They may file what's called a Subchapter S corporation tax return. An S corporation, very simply, is a small business entity where the owners of the business are shareholders. They're providing very small levels of goods and services most times. These are your typical small business owners who are just trying to live the American dream. Well, if you go into the information collection budget of the United States and take a look at the single tax form these S corporation owners have to file, it's called Form 1120S. That's the one that they use to declare some income and some taxes and basically try and square things with the IRS. Okay, that form, the 1120S, imposes a nationwide paperwork burden of 421 million with an M hours. There are about 4.4 million Subchapter S corporations filing that form. Do the math. Your typical Subchapter S corporation faces 100 hours of paperwork burden for that one lousy form. That doesn't include state taxes. It doesn't include payroll taxes. It doesn't include licenses. All other kinds of government paperwork that the small business owner faces. Can you imagine spending the equivalent of 2.5 weeks of your time on one stinking tax form just to keep in good with the IRS. We wonder why this country is so stacked against the small business owner and the entrepreneur. This is one illustration of it. It's incredible that the United States has such a vibrant small business sector, considering the burdens that government exacts from them.
So tax complexity is rising, along with the burden of paperwork, the amount of money Americans and businesses are spending, the amount of time they're spending. Is there any relief in sight, Pete? I mean, what are the solutions here? Do we need to pretty much just toss the tax code overboard and start over? Is that likely to happen?
I think most Americans would like to see us start from scratch. And as we were talking about earlier, the day of reckoning may come very soon because the system is just so complex, it's becoming difficult for computers or even the best tax professionals to keep up with all of this stuff. Now, will the political establishment respond before the whole thing collapses? That remains to be seen. Barack Obama and his spokespeople recently said that they want to form a new tax overhaul commission to put out a report that will hit the president's desk near the end of this year, and they will make concrete recommendations on how to streamline the system, make it more transparent. The problem is, of course, we've seen government by commission before when it comes to tax reform. I've been here the better part of 20 years, and I can recall at least half a dozen of these tax reform panels being named. Their reports are issued, they gather dust on a shelf, and the political establishment just goes on its merry way. We need to be much more proactive as citizens in demanding that something be done about the tax system itself. Otherwise, whatever this commission comes up with will probably suffer the same fate as the other reports. There are a whole lot of other statistics available in our annual report called A Taxing Trend. This is the 11th time that we have issued this report, so you've got a bunch of historical trends in there, everything from the growth of the tax forms themselves in number of lines, the number of pages in the instructions for filling out the tax forms, the various conflicting problems that tax preparers have had in trying to interpret these laws and do the best they can for their clients. All that information is contained in the National Taxpayers Union report. And of course, you can find it all online at our website, NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org. Now on Gimme Radio, speaking of taxpayers, this is normally the segment in which we talk about the outrage of the week. Folks, I think we've been talking about the outrage of the week for most of this program, the tax system and its complexity, but I will add to the outrage that you're probably already feeling by talking about one more aspect of the complexity of the system. This is the true outrage. Not only does the tax preparation community have trouble understanding the tax system? Not only do average people have trouble understanding the tax system, not only does the IRS have trouble understanding the tax system, but the investigators of the tax system itself have trouble understanding it all. A case in point is an audit by the Government Accountability Office. This is Congress's investigative arm. And what the Government Accountability Office did was send their auditors, posing as taxpayers, to go retain the services of major tax preparation firms at 19 outlets in a major metropolitan area. They posed various hypothetical situations to these tax preparation firms, and guess what the results were? 10 of the 19 preparers failed to report business income information that they should have. In 5 of the 10 instances where the client might qualify to claim the earned income credit, preparers claimed an ineligible child. Preparers tended to file inadequate deductions or failed to itemize in 7 of 9 applicable cases. Well, okay, the problem is with that, nobody can agree that these results actually meant anything. Why? Because the auditors for the Government Accountability Office consulted with Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation to develop, quote, correct answers, unquote, to the scenarios that the auditors posed to these preparation firms. What happened? Well, the Joint Committee on Taxation said a paid preparer might reach a reasonable conclusion different from our own on certain issues. Isn't that incredible? We go to try and audit preparation firms through a government agency and figure out if they're giving the right information to taxpayers. The audit gets done. Conclusions are reached that they're not getting the right information to taxpayers, and then the whole thing gets overturned because no one can agree on what the right information is. That's outrageous. One more case in point. PC World, the magazine for personal computing, did a test for a hypothetical tax-paying family and went online, tried to use 6 of the most popular tax preparation sites. They plugged in the same scenarios on each of the sites for a hypothetical tax-paying family with a kid. They got 6 different answers. In fact, the answers varied by $2,000, or about 10% of the family's total tax bill. Who knows? Nobody knows whether the tax system is something that is a fixed target or a moving one. That's the biggest outrage of our tax system itself. No one, not the government, not the people filling out the forms, not the people paying the taxes, can be certain about the law. Well, despite all this uncertainty over the tax laws, one thing is certain. It won't change unless more citizens, and I'm talking millions of citizens, get active in their own communities to change the way local, state, and federal governments treat taxpayers. The best way to do that is through our upcoming event, the National Taxpayers Conference, which will feature nuts and bolts training sessions, policy sessions, success stories to help inspire people to take back the government they once owned. It is a unique event. If you have any aspiration to become a citizen activist, even if you don't want to become a full-fledged taxpayer group leader, but you just want to become more knowledgeable on tax issues so you can directly contact your elected officials and know what you're talking about, this is the event for you. All skill levels, all ambitions for people who want to become more active on fiscal issues. You'll find it at National Taxpayers Conference. Isn't that correct, Natasha?
That's right, Pete. National Taxpayers Conference 2009 will take place June 11th through 13th this summer, just outside the nation's capital. You can register, get more information on our website, ntu.org. Visit the website for latest conference news, and we hope to see you this summer.
That about does it for this edition. I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power, and that means listening to Speaking of Taxpayers.